important people coming, including the keynote speaker. We're going to need to stay right on time. My name is David Savitz. I'm a professor at Brown University, and I'm the chair of the research committee. And if this works right, we're going to put them on. There's a number of areas of expertise represented, and just a very brief orientation for those of you not familiar. The research committee is a forum where we have discussions of new research initiatives, new requests for proposals. We review candidate applications that have come in and work very closely with the staff in providing our expertise and having really, I think, very fruitful discussions. And it's probably worth mentioning, and again, it's maybe a given in the way HEI does business, the relationship of the committee with the staff could not be better. It's a really outstanding staff. I think we each hopefully make our contributions well, and I feel like we work together to the benefit of the research program. So the names are listed there, and now we're going to see pictures. And I would ask if the committee members who are present would stand to be recognized. There are some of you there. And maybe just to mention, in the course of the meeting, we really do welcome discussions of ideas and thoughts and responses. This is a great forum for doing that informally in the hallways during breaks, meals, and so on. So again, thank you. Let me turn it over to Melissa.
Thank you so much, David. That was terrific. I'm Melissa Perry. I'm a professor at George Washington University, and I'm the chair of the review committee. The review committee has the really important work of ensuring that all of the science that the funded investigators produce gets synthesized and explained and communicated in the best way possible to contribute to the larger field. And so the review committee spends a lot of time reviewing the information that funded investigators provide in their final reports to ensure that they are quite useful. And it's always intended to go beyond only publications, but rather to ensure that the methodology is clearly laid out, the challenges, the many limitations and strengths that investigators encountered in doing the research, and also recommendations for going forward. So I can attest to how hard our review committee members work to make sure that the final reports are as value-added, beneficial, and contributory to better research in the future. So this is a list of our expertise in exposure assessment, toxicology, epidemiology, and statistics. And I'd love to have the members of the review committee who are here, if you could stand up so we can recognize you. So it takes quite a bit of investment and time and dedication to ensuring the whole pipeline process, from reviewing applications to deciding on funding to actually conducting the research, as many of the previously and currently funded investigators here can attest. And then the review committee makes sure that it is all comes to fruition and is highly productive for the long term. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to David, who will begin with our program this morning.
Good, thank you. The first speaker is Hanna Boogaard, who will be talking about the systematic review of, again, the title that Dan showed yesterday, the long title, Systematic Review of Selected Health Effects of Long-Term Exposure to Traffic-Related Air Pollution. We were all aware of Hanna's travel challenges. Dan kept us up to date. The only thing we were missing was the map that shows where the airplane is as it's making its way to Washington. But she has made it, and hopefully she's out here and ready to speak. So, Hanna, thank you for doing this. If we're going to be very conscious of managing the time carefully, because we have the keynote speaker who is, of course, on a tight schedule. And so if there's time permitting, we'll be happy to have questions, but it really depends on how, the presentation. So it's up to you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David. I have to see how it works here.
Sorry. You could use that. Green is the button goes forward, just the big green goes forward, yeah. As I understand.
Well, thank you all so much. Just waiting for my slides here. Very nice to be here, for sure. It's so nice to see you, so many of you in person, and I'm just happy. And it's an exciting day, actually. You know, so I'm delighted to talk about this. So really, the great news is that the new HEI traffic review has been published. It's online for everybody to see. We published it last week. And also, I would like to invite everybody to join us for a webinar on July 13 for a deeper dive into the evidence. Because, of course, you can appreciate that the report is huge. It's a beast, really. It's more than 600 pages. So I'm sure you've all read it by now. But let me walk you through it. So it all started with an earlier HEI traffic review. This one was published in 2010. At the time, the evidence was considered sufficient to support a causal relationship between traffic-related air pollution and exacerbation of asthma in children, and there was only limited or suggestive evidence for all the other health outcomes that were looked at. Now a lot of things have changed in the meantime. There's much more research regarding the health effects of traffic-related air pollution. The regulations and vehicle technology have advanced, emissions are declining, and there's much more interest these days in the non-tailpipe emissions as well as in traffic and noise. That's exactly why we started a new review in 2018, a systematic review this time around. And of course, this is all teamwork. We worked with a great expert panel chaired by Francesco Forestiera and Fred Lerman, all great experts on epidemiology, on exposure assessment, on statistics. You'll see also that some of the HEI research committee also joined the HEI panel. And just a quick shout out also to Melton Cutler-Josh, as well as to many of the folks at HEI, in particular Alison Patton, that have done a lot of work on this traffic review. Now, the special report was subjected to detailed peer review that is common for all HEI's research. That process was chaired by Bert Brunekreef. And again, you'll see here some members also from our own HEI review committee that also acted as reviewers for this special report. So a big thanks to all those reviewers and for all the great work. And of course, the special report was edited by HEI's publication department. That's also a lot of work. It's really a work in the background, but very important. So we have published a review protocol. It's online for everybody to see. We have used standard methods. We summarized the epidemiologic results quantitatively where possible. We included an evaluation of the risk of bias in individual studies. We have used a risk of bias tool from the WHO that were also used in the systematic reviews underpinning the air quality guidelines. And at the end of the day, we reached conclusions about the confidence in the evidence. So a few important methodological features I would like you to be aware of. Really, this is the largest effort of this type to date. Nevertheless, because the research field is so huge, we had to make some painful decisions. For example, we evaluated the epidemiological literature only, and we focused on a selected set of health outcomes that were chosen a priori. Notably missing from the list of health outcomes you'll see here are the neurologic outcomes. We have specific chapters on those outcomes in the special report, but those outcomes were not as comprehensively assessed as some of those others. That's why, today I will not talk about those neurologic outcomes. A key feature really is that we only selected traffic-related air pollution studies. We focused only on long-term exposure studies. And we assessed the confidence in the evidence using two complementary methods that were considered equally valuable, with ratings of very low, low, moderate to high. For traffic-related air pollution as a mixture, not individual pollutants. A few words on the exposure assessment. As I mentioned, a key feature of this review is the selection of only traffic-related air pollution studies. Now, that's not an easy task. We all know that the exposure assessment of traffic-related air pollution is challenging. It's a complex mixture, and it's characterized by high spatial and temporal variability. And also, there is still no pollutant specific for traffic, and traffic-related air pollution impacts at different scales. It's not only the near-road environment that is impacted by traffic-related air pollution. We know traffic-related air pollution, it travels. It also affects the general environment, the neighborhood environment, the urban environments, and even beyond that. So we developed 3 strategies to select in a transparent way whether a study was considered traffic-related or not. It's based on the selection of traffic-related pollutants. It's based on the exposure assessment methods, as well as the spatial resolution of the exposure models. So a few words on the confidence assessment. As I mentioned, we have used 2 complementary methods. We've used a modified OHEAD method. I will talk about OHEAD in a second. And we used a narrative assessment. For the modified OHEAD, that was conducted for each exposure outcome pair by study design. That was averaged for each exposure outcome pair, and then averaged for each health outcome. Then in addition, a narrative assessment was conducted. And then those 2 different but complementary assessments were ultimately combined into one overall confidence rating. Now on OHEAD, there is this initial rating based on study design features. You'll see the study design features in the gray box here. And then there is up and downgrading based on certain factors. For example, there's downgrading based on a risk of bias, and there's upgrading based on dose response or consistency. Now, in original grade guidance, all epidemiologic studies start at a low confidence. For the OHEAD approach, they decided that also prospective cohort studies could start with moderate confidence, whereas in the traffic review, we decided that all cohort studies, as well as case control studies, could start at moderate confidence level. Why? Basically because 3 of the 4 features, design features that are in this gray box, were often met for those designs. And the only feature that was not met was the controlled exposure feature, and basically only random controlled trials can meet that feature. Now, the panel deemed it necessary to accompany this grade type assessment with a broader narrative assessment. The grade methods was difficult to apply, it was a challenge. And also it focused more on the quality of the body of evidence, and it was heavily geared towards studies entering a meta-analysis. So that's why we added this narrative approach. Now, next I'm going to show you some result slides. Again, this is just a snapshot just to give you a flavor. So we searched the literature starting from 1980 all the way up to 2019. So 1980 is also the start date of the earlier HEI traffic review. And at the end of the day, we included about 350 studies in our systematic review. About half of them entered also a meta-analysis. And in addition, we had about 69 studies on neurologic outcomes. And as I mentioned before, there are separate sort of literature reviews on those outcomes. So most of the most common outcomes that were studied were respiratory outcomes in children, as well as birth outcomes. Fewer studies were available for respiratory outcomes in adults, cardiometabolic outcomes, and mortality. And most of the studies were published relatively recent, after 2008. So 2008 is the cutoff date of the earlier HEI traffic review. So most of the studies were conducted in either Europe or North America. Studies in Asia, predominantly China, emerged more recently, and there's a clear need for more traffic-related air pollution and health studies in low and middle-income countries. So this is a plot where you'll see the number of studies by outcome and pollutant. NO2 was the exposure indicator that was most commonly reported, followed by elemental carbon / black carbon and PM2.5. Also a note that about half of the studies also included indirect traffic measures, such as distance to roadways or traffic density. Although those studies are informative, the panel was not able to combine those indirect traffic measures in a meta-analysis because of all those varying definitions. Also a note here is that there were very few long-term studies identified for ultrafine particles and for non-tailpipe PM indicators. Also a note here is that many of the studies reported on more than one exposure metric. And of course, when those met our exposure framework, we extracted all that information. Now I'm going to show you 4 slides on some meta-analysis, so please bear with me. I know it's a lot. You will see many of those forest plots in the report. What you'll see here is NO2 and all-cause mortality. You'll see here the individual studies that were identified. You'll see the individual risk estimates as well as the combined summary estimate in bold. Basically, positive associations were reported from almost all the individual studies, reporting a positive association between NO2 and all-cause mortality. And you'll see also a positive estimate of the summary estimate, as well as the estimate is statistically significant. Moving on, so those are the main meta-analyses that were conducted for the outcome all-cause mortality. So not only on NO2 that I showed you before, but basically for all the other pollutants that we had sufficient studies on to conduct a meta-analysis. Bottom line, positive associations between all the traffic-related pollutants and all-cause mortality, ranging from a point estimate of 1.01 to 1.06. And you'll see also that for the pollutants that we had most studies on, NO2, elemental carbon, and PM2.5, those estimates were all statistically significant. Two notes here. The effect estimates cannot be directly compared across the different traffic-related pollutants because the selected increments do not necessarily represent the same exposure contrast. So we decided to use the increments from ESCAPE/ELAPSE study. That's a huge study in Europe, but of course it depends on the location where you're at. what the real exposure increment is for the population in a given city or whatever. Another notice, and I think I cannot stress this enough, the individual pollutants are considered indicators of the traffic-related air pollution mixture. This is another meta-analysis. You'll see basically the same information as the earlier plot, but then also for some causes of mortality, such as circulatory mortality and ischemic heart disease mortality, and then only for the pollutants that we had most studies on. Bottom line, similar positive associations between the pollutants and the selected mortality outcomes. You'll see also that for lung cancer mortality and respiratory mortality, you'll see that there were generally fewer studies, and you'll see that also reflecting in wider confidence intervals. This is my last meta-analysis slide. I know it's a lot, so basically this is the same slide as before, but then for some morbidity outcomes, some birth outcomes, some respiratory outcomes, and some cardiometabolic outcomes. The story is more complicated for some of the morbidity outcomes compared to the mortality outcomes. There were often fewer studies available for some of those morbidity outcomes. In particular for cardiometabolic outcomes, there was an issue. And also for that particular body of evidence, the panel was pretty concerned about potential outcome misclassification for some of those cardiometabolic outcomes. Regarding respiratory outcomes, strongest evidence was found for asthma onset in both children as well as in adults, as well as in acute lower respiratory infections in children. And really NO2 played a major role in that evaluation. On birth outcomes, most evidence was found for term low birth weight and small for gestational age. Notably, positive associations were reported between PM2.5 and those birth outcomes, whereas basically null results were reported for NO2 and elemental carbon and basically all the 4 birth outcomes that we looked at. You'll see here only 2 in this plot. So basically this slide is the results of the confidence assessment. So basically that's the last step in the systematic review, looking at the full body of evidence. So not only focusing on like one pollutant, but really looking at the body of evidence, including the indirect traffic measures. So the findings, so at the end of the day, the panel concluded that the confidence in the evidence for an association with long-term exposure to traffic-related air pollution was high for all-cause mortality, it was high for circulatory mortality, it was high for ischemic heart disease mortality. It was also moderate to high for asthma onset in both children and adults, as well as moderate to high for acute lower respiratory infections. Now, for all the other outcomes that we've looked at, and we've looked at many of the outcomes, the evidence was considered either moderate or low, very low, and some of those outcomes are also not in this summary plot. So wrapping up here, some key observations. This review has 3 times more studies than the 2010 report. Now, it's a little difficult to compare because, we've used, there's a difference in scope, in methods, but for sure there are many, many more studies these days. About half of the studies that we identified ended up in a meta-analysis. The most common reason for a lower confidence judgment was imprecision, particularly for the cardiometabolic outcomes. The most common reason for a higher confidence rating was evidence for a monotonic exposure-response relationship. Also a note that most of the studies were rated as either low or moderate risk of bias. for all but the confounder domain. And for the confounder domain, about 1/3 of the studies that ended up in a meta-analysis were rated as high risk of bias. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that we downgraded all those exposure outcome pairs because of that, only when the difference in when the results of those high risk of bias studies were clearly different compared to the results of the lower risk of bias studies, then that can be a reason for a downgrade. Although the evidence is compelling for some of the morbidity and mortality outcomes, the panel identified several future research opportunities, and I have listed here a few. We have many, many, many more in the report. We actually have a huge table in chapter 14. Take a look there. Just a few things to highlight. We focused on an evaluation of the epidemiologic literature only. There in the special report you will find a chapter on sort of the mechanistic evidence, but clearly, that was limited. That's exactly why the panel stayed away from using causal determinations or talking about causal associations, etc. It would have aided the panel if we had done a more thorough evaluation on the mechanism. So I guess that is work for another day. We focused only on traffic-related air pollution. We looked also at traffic noise to some extent, but there's a clear need for more studies that evaluate the role of spatially correlated factors that may either confound or modify the health effects of traffic-related air pollution. Think about, all the factors related to the built environment, etc. Also, there's a clear need to evaluate the fuller range of potential impacts of transportation and new mobility on public health. Think also about sort of the physical activity part, active transportation, as a way to mitigate some of the health effects of traffic-related air pollution. And finally, there's also a clear need to improve methods in systematic review and evidence synthesis of observational studies in environmental health. My time is up, so I'm not going to talk about this last point. We have, you will find quite some discussion on those issues in the final report, in the special report. We also submitted a journal paper on those lessons learned for evidence synthesis. And this is my last slide. I'm not going to read this aloud, but really in light of the large number of people exposed, not only in the near-road environment, the findings indicated that traffic-related air pollution remain an important public health concern, and it deserves greater attention from the public as well as from policy makers. So that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanna. Thank you very much. I can imagine it's not easy to have a 20-minute talk on a 600-page report. Again, even though there's not time for questions, it's still early enough in the meeting that hopefully if you have questions for Hanna, you can find her over the course of the next couple days. The next presentation is going to be by Jie Chen from Harvard University on investigating determinants of the magnitude and shape of the association between long-term PM2.5 exposure and mortality, harmonized analysis in 3 large studies in Canada, the United States, and Europe. And I'll just mention as a casual observation, both of these projects are the kinds of things that it's hard to imagine anyone other than HEI taking them on. These would not happen on their own, and they're important projects, and again, helping to sort of clarify exactly the kinds of things that HEI alone is able to do so well. So, Jie?
Yeah, okay, thank you for having me. So, on behalf of the labs, Maple and Harvard teams, I'm going to give an update of the harmonized analysis performed in these 3 large studies in Canada, US, and Europe. The topic of this presentation can be summarized as determinants of the magnitude and shape of the associations between long-term PM2.5 exposure and mortality. So start with the background. A causal relationship has been concluded by the US EPA in the 2019 Integrated Science Assessment between long-term PM2.5 exposure and all-cause mortality, which indicates that population health can benefit from reduction in ambient PM2.5 concentrations. And to evaluate the benefits of reduction in PM2.5 concentrations, we need to understand both the magnitude of the PM2.5 mortality risk and the shape of the relationship. Studies across the world have generally reported positive associations between PM2.5 exposure and mortality, but the magnitude of the associations differ substantially across studies. And the heterogeneity across studies have been speculated to be related to study populations, PM2.5 exposure levels, PM2.5 composition, exposure assessment, and statistical models applied in different studies. But little systematic evaluation has been performed on these factors. In 2015, HEI founded 3 large teams to estimate the effects of exposure to low levels of air pollution. The 3 teams were led by Professor Michael Brewer at University of British Columbia in Canada, and Professor Francisca Dominici at Harvard University in US, and Professor Bert Brunnicliffe at Utrecht University in Europe. The 3 study areas have relatively low PM2.5 exposure levels compared to the current air quality standards and guidelines. And the study populations included in these 3 studies were very large, which allows great statistical power to investigate health effects of low-level air pollution. The final reports of the ELAPSE study and the Medicare study has been published last year and earlier this year. And the MAPLE report will be published later this year, but their interim report was published in 2019. So in these 3 studies, a positive association between PM2.5 exposure and mortality was observed. And the difference in the magnitude of associations is modest across these 3 studies. The highest association was observed in the ELAPSE study, which is 1.05 per 5 microgram per cubic meter increase in PM2.5. And the lowest association is observed in the Medicare cohort, which is 1.03. The ELAPSE estimate has a relatively large confidence interval compared to the 2 other studies because this is a meta-analytical estimate from 7 administrative cohorts across Europe, and there are large heterogeneity in the effect estimates across these 7 cohorts. And the MAPLE study includes a stack can-checked cohort, which is created by enrollees in 1991, 1996, and 2001. And the participants has baseline age above 25 years old. And the Medicare is an open cohort with enrollees from 2000 to 2016, whose baseline age was above 65 years old. And the ELAPSE participants has baseline age above 30 years old. The 3 studies further applied different exposure assessment methodology. So one of the difference in the exposure assessment is the spatial resolution of the exposure surface. So while MAPLE and Medicare applied PM2.5 exposure surfaces of 1 by 1 kilometer square, ELAPSE applied an exposure surface which has a spatial resolution of 100 by 100 meter. And in terms of outcome, the Medicare cohort analyzed all-cause mortality, while MAPLE and ELAPSE analyze natural mortality, which is all-cause mortality excluding accidental mortality and suicides. And the 3 studies adjusted for different sets of covariates in the statistical model, depending on the availability in the cohorts. And the Medicare cohort has relatively limited covariates available at the individual level. So there are other differences across these three studies, such as the exposure level and composition of PM2.5. So the aim of this harmonized analysis is to investigate and discuss the impact of determinants of the association between long-term PM2.5 exposure and mortality. In the harmonized analysis, we restricted participants to those who were above 65 years old at baseline. And we applied a common exposure assessment methodology, which is the one previously applied in the MAPLE study that has 1 by 1 kilometer spatial resolution. And we applied analysis for all-cause mortality because this is available across all three cohorts. And we specified common covariate models, which includes covariates that cover the same concepts across cohorts. And I will elaborate more in the next slide. So we evaluated the linear association by applying a Cox proportional hazard model, incorporating PM2.5 as time-varying exposure. And we also evaluated the exposure response relationships by performing an extended shape constraint health impact function, ESHIF. This methodology relates risk to concentration suitable for quantitative benefit analysis. So we specified 4 common covariate models with increasing control of potential confounders. And this table here shows the covariates that were adjusted for in each individual cohort. So ELAPSE has 6 administrative cohorts that were included in this analysis, and they were analyzed independently. And in Model 1, we included identical covariates that are available across all the cohorts, that is age, sex, and follow-up year. And in Model 2, we further adjusted for variables that representing race or ethnicity, and variables that representing socioeconomic status at individual level. The definition of the variables differ across the cohorts. And in Model 3, we further adjusted for variables that representing area level, socioeconomic status. So different variables were included in Model 3, and they are all covering multiple dimensions of this socioeconomic status. And in Model 4, we further adjusted for large-scale regional indicators. This is used to account for the broad-scale spatial variation that in mortality risks. So next, I'm going to show you some results. This figure shows the hazard ratio for PM2.5 per 5 microgram per cubic meter from the harmonized model 4, which is the main model in the harmonized analysis, in blue, and the original studies in red. So here we see that the variation in the magnitude of associations across studies only reduced slightly in the harmonized analysis compared to the original report. And this figure shows the hazard ratios derived from the minimally adjusted Model 1 and the main Model 4 in the harmonized analysis. And here we see that with more stringent covariate controls, hazard ratios increase in all 3 studies, and the difference between studies reduced. And in Medicare and ELAPSE, we further compared the hazard ratios by applying different exposure assessment, which is the harmonized exposures. That is actually the MAPLE exposure that were previously used, and the original exposures applied in Medicare and ELAPSE. And here we see that the hazard ratio is similar in the Medicare cohort and also in the ELAPSE cohort, ELAPSE study. But here the ELAPSE estimate is a meta-analytical estimate of 6 administrative cohorts included in this analysis. So actually the difference in the individual cohort is substantial. And in CanTrack, which is the MAPLE study, and ELAPSE, we were also able to compare the estimates derived from the 65 years old plus and the full population, which is population age above 25 years old at baseline in CanTrack and population age above 30 in ELAPSE. So here we see that the effect estimates is similar in the CanTrack cohort in 2 populations, and in ELAPSE, the hazard ratio is higher in the full population compared to the seniors. And in CanTrack and ELAPSE, we were also able to compare the hazard ratios for all-cause mortality and natural mortality. And here we see that the difference for these 2 outcomes is minor. So this slide shows the shape of the PM2.5 mortality exposure response relationship in individual cohorts. So the blue line shows the E-shift prediction with the shaded area indicating the 95% confidence interval. And here we can see that the shape of the curves differ across individual cohorts, but we generally see positive associations down to the lowest exposure level in individual cohorts. And in this slide, we added a combined E-shift, which is the blue line in the middle, and the confidence interval in the shaded area. And the thickness of the individual curve indicates the ways that each individual cohort contributed to the combined E-shift. So here we see that the curve is almost linearly increasing until about 15 microgram per cubic meter, and then flatten out. So to summarize, we applied a harmonized analytical approach, which only marginally reduced the differences in the observed associations across studies, and full harmonization was not possible. And we see that the age of study populations, confounders adjusted for exposure assessment methodology applied, or impacted the magnitude of the observed associations. But the positive associations were observed in all cases. We also see that hazard ratios increase in all 3 studies with more stringent confounder control. And the shape of the concentration response relationship differ between cohorts, but generally showed associations down to the lowest observed levels. A combined E-shift suggested a near linear relationship that flattens out at higher concentrations. So lastly, I would like to thank all the amazing collaborators that make this work possible. And we have poster sessions this afternoon on the harmonized analysis, and we look forward to discussing with you more.
Thank you. Very nice summary of some very impressive project. We have a few minutes now. If there are questions, first from the audience that's here in person, any questions? If so, just go to the microphones. We'll give it a minute to see if people have issues to raise. Any? No one's? Yes, you have to go to the microphone, please. Thanks.
Hello. For both studies, I guess I have a question, which is the absence of the social economic data seems to be a bias, for lack of a better term, in the context that we know that income, race, ethnicity have longer-term effects. There was, in the first study, this whole conversation around outcomes related to birth rates, et cetera. Those seem to be tied to other data that says that there's a relatively high mortality rate among women of color with respect to birth mortality that you don't see. Were there adjustments made in the studies to explain that kind of piece? And then my second question, and then I'll sit down, has to do with this issue of exposure and how do we extrapolate what we have observed in the future when the fleet mix is going to be significantly different with electric vehicles, with hybrid vehicles, with non-internal combustion. And I'm sorry, I do have a third question, which has to do with, as we deal with this issue of goods movement, we are increasingly seeing more intermodal facilities between rail and trucks going through residential neighborhoods just because that's where they're located. And when we talk about the exposures and outcomes, how was that factored into the analysis of the studies that were done?
Good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I think the scope of this harmonized analysis is quite different from what you were looking for. But I mean, in the final reports, there are actually analysis on the disparities and things that you just mentioned. And I think especially in the Medicare report, there are a lot of investigations on this. So maybe you can refer to that. And no.
Maybe again, I think it's an important issue, and it won't go away. But the issue, obviously, of socioeconomic confounding is so challenging because the construct is so difficult to capture fully. We routinely say, yes, we've adjusted for education, we've adjusted for income, and when you think about the disparities that exist in this country, that's the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to that experience that is very challenging to isolate, and I think this is not a new issue to confront. It's an old issue, but it remains a real challenge in these types of studies. The second question may come up actually in the next session on the mobility issue, but maybe a good place to raise it there as those issues arise. Any other questions? If any online, or otherwise we can proceed. Thank you very much, Jie.
All right. Moving right along, we're doing great on time. Thank you for your attention and interest. Now we have the pleasure of being able to hear updates from various programs from the Health Effects Institute. And so first, we'll start with Dr. Ella Mantus, and she'll be talking about the air pollution program. Afterward, we'll hear from Dr. Donna Vorhees, and she'll be talking about the energy program. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Pallavi Pant, and we'll be hearing about the global health program. So Ellen, take it away.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. So I have the pleasure of talking about some activities in our health effects program on air pollution, and it's gonna be a fast-paced overview here. So I think you've heard during this session about the strategic plan for HEI. I'm just gonna mention the 4 different areas that we have. It's the accountability program, complex questions for air pollution mixtures, transport and urban health, and global health. And you'll hear more about the global health from Pallavi Pant, who will talk more about that, and I'll leave that to her. There are cross-cutting issues across all these 4 areas. We have transparency issues, data access, statistical methods, and looking at sensitive population that affect all the different areas. You can find information on all our studies on our website, so be sure to always check our website for that, and you've had the opportunity yesterday to talk to some of the investigators at our poster sessions, and we have another poster session, and I encourage everybody to talk to our investigators and see what's going on in detail. So I'm just going to highlight some of the things going on in the different areas. In the accountability area, and I'll just remind everybody, this is looking at how things change once we change our policies associated with air quality, and what the outcomes are. And some of the new studies of this past year, we have a study that has to do with COVID research and looking at whether changes in mortality have occurred that are associated with changes in 2 different pollutants, the before, during, and after these COVID lockdown policies in 4 different countries. We have, you saw last night, our award of our Rosenblith Award. That study is in our accountability section, and that's going to be developing national fine scale and daily PM 2.5 source impact exposure estimates in the United States. And that's, again, for regulatory accountability. And also we'll have an environmental justice component and trying to identify exposure inequities. And a third study is comparing effects of selected policies of mobile vehicles and electricity generating units, looking to improve air quality, and then looking at the associated health benefits that might be associated with those policies. We also have several ongoing studies that have been working their way toward completion. We will be having one study being completed in the upcoming year that has to do with comparing student health and performance in school districts where they've instituted programs with, to replace or retrofit diesel school buses, and comparing those to the areas that don't have those programs. There's also one looking at evaluating the birth outcomes of given policies in Texas associated with trying to curb transportation emissions. And then we have 2 studies in China that are looking at associated changes, one in mortality with 2, looking at 2 cohorts and those national policies to reduce emissions. A similar study looking at health effects and air pollution associated specifically with the Chinese policy to ban coal heaters. And in our area of complex questions for air pollution mixtures, you've already heard about our low dose studies, what we refer to as our low exposure studies, that we're looking at the air pollution exposures with health effects below the standards. Again, you've heard that both the European and the American study were published last year, and we will be publishing the Canadian study in July. And then we also have studies in this area looking at strategies for enhanced exposure assessment and quantifying the influence of exposure measurement error. And another area is looking at the susceptibility of COVID health outcomes and in association with air pollution. 2 new studies this year have to do with the influence of biomass burning, both the wildland fires and prescribed burns, and their association on various health effects. And moving to our transport and urban health, you've already heard the excellent presentation by Hanna about the traffic literature review. And again, another plug for the webinar in July. Be sure to tune in for that. And then we have several studies that are going to be finishing up this year that are looking at this relationship between traffic-related air pollution and the influence of the factors of noise, green space, socioeconomic status, and other factors, again, in some ways responding already to one of the recommendations from the transportation report. And then Dan mentioned last night all the different publications we've had in the past year, all sorts of different subjects relating to social susceptibility of multiple air pollutants and in relationship to cardiovascular disease was published by Jane Clardy and her colleagues, a report on changes in brain structure and children published by the investigators were Monica Gushens and her colleagues, and then looking around changes in health effects associated with changes in policies around ports in California was one of our accountability studies, also published last year by Dr. Meng and colleagues. And you'll hear more about our Global Burden of Disease report from Pallavi. And again, we've already talked about the 2 very influential policy relevant reports with the low exposure studies. And just a couple of upcoming and activities that are happening. One, we have a new funding opportunity in progress right now, looking at the quantification of real-world impacts of non-tailpipe particulate emissions, that we have final applications that have been submitted on that funding opportunity, and we'll have decisions no later than the fall. We just recently had a webinar series on health applications of satellite data. You can check out the recordings and presentations that were made. We had over 580 people participating in a webinar series that took place over 4 weeks that just happened, so please check that out if you didn't have the opportunity to participate at the time. And our last opportunity that we're looking into is one centered around environmental justice. We're looking at having a workshop, a targeted workshop in October associated with that, and trying to see where HEI might be able to contribute in this area and make some progress. And I think that's it for me, and I'm going to turn it over to Donna to take a tour through the energy program.
Thank you, Ellen. Good morning, everybody. Really glad to be here today and give you a quick update on the energy program. I think as most of you know, we exist to provide credible science on community exposures and health effects associated with unconventional oil and gas development. I'll refer to it as a UOGD, also commonly known as fracking. Wrong big green button. Okay, we have three major categories of activities. Research is obviously our main reason for being, but we also continue to review the literature, basically assessing the state of the science to make sure that the research we fund remains relevant. I'm going to take this off if that's okay with everybody. And we're also continuing to engage with those stakeholders who we hope will one day be using the results of this research. The research, as I said, will be community exposure research. We've funded 5 studies. 3 include teams who will be collaborating to understand exposures associated with air quality and noise, and 2 research teams who will be working independently to understand exposures related to water quality. The research is going to be located in multiple major oil and gas producing regions of the United States. And as I said, there will be 3 research teams collaborating to understand exposures related to air quality and noise. This research is going to take about 3 years. They will be using a combination of stationary, mobile, and passive monitoring over this time period to capture the tremendous spatial and temporal variability that exists with these types of operations. The collaboration is called TRACER, and in addition to the monitoring, it will also involve development of a model. Those of you following climate change research may be aware of the MEET model, the Methane Emissions Estimation Tool, MEET model. That model predicts methane emissions from production of oil and gas in the United States. As part of this collaboration, they will be expanding that model in 2 really important ways. One is to include pre-production activities. So these are the things you probably have heard of, drilling and hydraulic fracturing and the traffic associated with them. So incorporate methane emissions from those pre-production operations, and also to expand the list of chemicals involved. So not just methane, but a number of chemicals that are of concern for human health. The water quality teams will be working independently. They will be working over a tighter time frame of 1 to 1.5 years, and that's because they're using existing data for their analyses, combining it with statistical modeling to assess whether there are plausible links between UOGD and observed contamination in both groundwater and surface water. Our Energy Research Committee expects a lot from this research, and they identified many criteria for selection in the original RFA. I want to just highlight some of the major attributes that apply to all of them. One is the ability to link specific UOGD processes to exposure, should those links exist. In other words, don't just measure benzene in air or water, tell me where it came from, which process gave rise to it. The other attribute, provide knowledge useful for other locations and other conditions. So there are a lot of oil and gas producing regions, tremendous variability. The methods, and particularly the model being developed as part of this research, can be adapted for use in any oil and gas producing region. Be useful for decisions. HEI always strives for this. We are doing the same. And in this context, we're talking about decisions not only by state and federal policymakers and industry, but also the people living near these operations, and to help them make decisions about them and what it might mean for their health. We continue to learn. We learn from our stakeholders. We've had a series of stakeholder workshops where we hear from experts and others about ongoing research, and we'll continue with that. We keep reading the literature, and it's growing and growing, preparing reviews and research briefs that are all on our website. And you'll also find on our website a literature hub page where we have an online literature database and a spatial bibliography you can click on your favorite state and find out what research is going on there. And we'll continue to update this, again, to make sure that the research stays relevant and we're educated about the latest science. We're striving to do a better job with stakeholder engagement. We created principles for stakeholder engagement in 2021 with emphasis on communicating not just with HEI's usual crowd, but also communities and EJ communities in particular. We're in the early phases of implementing this guidance. We just wrapped up our initial open houses, both in person and open house, to introduce communities to the research, hear their questions and concerns. We also continue to engage in outreach with our broader stakeholder group through an educational webinar series. And I'd be remiss not to put a plug in for our next webinar, which is July 19th, on research fatigue. No, I'm not talking about tired scientists. I'm talking about communities who are tired of being investigated. And so the purpose of the webinar is for all of you and to give you tips on doing research when you are dealing with communities who are tired of being studied. And looking ahead, the engagement continues, the research continues. You can go to our website and find out what we're doing. You can be in touch with me. Anna Rosofsky's here and can fill you in on everything. She's working with the principal investigators pretty much on a daily basis. And we're also planning for future research, both about UOGD and considering ways to expand our scope of research. And with that, I thank you for your attention and turn it over to Pallavi Pant.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to quickly walk us through our global health program, which is slowly growing. And since 2019, when we were last in person together in Seattle, we've made some progress. So for those of you who may be new to HEI, the Global Health Program is a somewhat smaller program that functions within HEI with support from philanthropies, foundations, multilateral agencies, and other international organizations. And we tend to focus on questions in areas where air pollution levels are pretty high, but at the same time, the scientific information, the technical expertise may not be where we would like it to be to influence policy decisions. And to do this work, we focus on a few different approaches depending on the geography or the country. Our flagship program in global health is what we call the State of Global Air. We collaborate very closely with the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation and their Global Burden of Disease study, which uses the comparative risk assessment framework to produce air quality and health impact estimates for countries around the world. And often when we start talking about the big air pollution impacts or the fact that air pollution levels are very high, the questions come to, what are the sources? What can we do to fix it? So over the last 5 to 7 years, HEI has also been working to try and identify the major sources of air pollution in countries around the world so that we can use that information more effectively for decision making. And the way we work within the global program in different regions and countries is through producing targeted analyses, often in close collaboration with research institutions and others that are in that country and know best the relevant questions and the relevant science. And also by trying to work and enhance the technical strength, the collaborative networks of engagement that focus on air pollution and health in those particular countries. In fact, HEI has a very long history of supporting large capacity building programs around air pollution and health in many regions. So State of Global Air, which has been in action now since 2017, is essentially a way for us to communicate findings on trends in air quality using estimates from the global burden of disease. And we try to look at different questions over time, the impacts of air pollution on health, the impacts on life expectancy, how countries are doing with respect to the new WHO guidelines, et cetera. And this type of data and information is being used by a variety of audiences. So we tend to focus on the non-scientific audiences, including civil society groups, policymakers, education, the education sector, the media, and often the data from SOGA get used for classroom lectures. I think I spoke to a couple of people yesterday who said they were using it in reporting on issues related to air pollution, and also by civil society groups and decision makers in some places to try and identify ways to address air pollution. We have some very exciting reports coming up this year, starting with a report on health and air quality trends in cities, which is work that Dr. Susan Annenberg has been working on, and we're collaborating with her. Following that, we'll also be producing a report on air quality and health in Africa in the run-up to the upcoming Conference of Parties meeting, or COP meeting, as you may have heard it as, which is going to be in Egypt in November. And then sometime this year, perhaps towards the end of the year, we are also hoping to produce the next version of our State of Global Air annual report, which will for the first time include information on long-term exposures to nitrogen dioxide, following from what we heard on the traffic review that is going to be an important data set for countries and cities around the world, and also estimates on asthma burden in children, again, in countries around the world, so do stay tuned for that. As Ellen mentioned, in December of 2021, we published a report which was led by Erin McDuffie, Mike Brower, and Randall Martin, looking at major sources of air pollution in countries around the world. And the goal with this type of data is to identify what the major sources are, and then use that information to inform air quality management decisions that may be taking place. And the work is already being used by scientists to do further research, but also in some places to raise and highlight sources that may not receive the same type of attention in individual countries as policies around energy and air quality get made. We also work in specific regions, and that's one of the focuses of the program. And at the moment, or over the last 1 year, we have been working in 2 regions: Southeast Europe, which includes some EU member countries, and a number of countries in the Western Balkans. This is an area with relatively high levels of air pollution, but often not the same attention to the air pollution problem and not the same amount of research. There's a lot of text on the slide. I'm not gonna try and go through all of this. But to highlight that in the region, we are working very closely with medical universities and academic institutions, as well as civil society groups, to try and synthesize what's available and what can be used to inform current decisions, as well as research that could be undertaken going forward. And in order to do that, we've published 2 reports that came out in the last few weeks, and we're planning to publish another one that will focus on Serbia. That'll come out in July. And we have continued to host training webinars and meetings to try and figure out the best opportunities for action and intervention towards improvement in air quality. And in India, which has been sort of in the news for a long time on air pollution, and where HEI has had a long history of engaging around research, last year we launched a network which is focusing on bringing together air quality, modeling, epidemiology, and public health experts to think about relevant questions related to science on health effects of air pollution for India, and how we can do them in a way that policy decisions today and tomorrow can be made. So again, trying to further the science policy continuum in India and address questions of relevance. So there we are also hoping to fund specific research studies that will not only help us guide what decisions get made in India, but also help the global understanding of what high levels of exposure to air pollution can do to people's health. And to learn more about these programs and to give us feedback, please join us during the poster session. We have 2 posters, one on State of Global Air and then one on the broader global program. We're also very excited to be launching some new work in East Africa. We're just starting to work in Kenya and Uganda. So we look forward to any ideas and suggestions and sort of networks that you might have in that region to help us make progress and to help us see where we can make a meaningful contribution. And I'd just like to highlight some of our committee members who have been helping guide the program and lead us through. I think 4 of them are with us at the conference, Eloise Murray, Mikhail Krzyzanowski, Kalpana Balakrishnan, and Kiros Berhane. So if you see them, you can also ask them about what the program is doing. And finally, I'll just thank the staff that work on this program. Some of us are here at the conference, so again, we'll see you at the poster session and look forward to any suggestions and thoughts you have for the program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to each of you for those excellent presentations. I want to make a shout out to anyone that might be new to the Health Effects Institute, and especially to junior investigators that may be just learning for the first time some of the broad breadth and depth of the work that HEI does. Please don't be shy to reach out to these leaders and talk to them about your interests and anything that may have occurred to you as you listen to these presentations. You can tell how vibrant and active the programs are at HEI, and we're always looking for new investigators, new partners, new collaborators. So with that, we're excited about the next part of this program.